Wi-Fi, as well as being on our Zoom webinar as well. So I'm going to kick off, if that's all right with the attendees just now. And I will once again welcome the face of the world game, Miss Lucy Zelic, to our Talking Football event with Football Coaches Australia in partnership with them. And very honoured to have members of the Executive Committee of Football Coaches Australia, including Gary Cole, Karen Gregor and the CEO Glenn Warry on the event. Lucy, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I sincerely appreciate your time and taking you away from your bub. But I really appreciate you coming on this evening, and hopefully we're going to have a good chat. As I say, we're on Facebook and we are on Zoom, so this should be hopefully a very good conversation. So thank you for joining us this evening, Lucy.
No, absolutely delighted to be here. Always love to talk football, even if it does mean that I'm away from my baby at tea time. So it's good to see a good group here together tonight. And I'm hoping that we have some good, robust conversations, because there's certainly a hell of a lot going on in the game right now, isn't there?
Yeah, certainly a lot going on. And I think, you know, with the COVID regulations now taking a little bit of a back seat as well, we're hopefully going to get some more traction and on the field as well. But yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of different things that we can talk about. But I do want to kick off with quite a topical subject, if you don't mind, Lucy. We heard today that Tom Smithies from the Telegraph is now taking a leave. He's no longer going to be sharpening his pencil. And obviously we lost Ray Gatt 12 months ago as well, in terms of the journalism from Talking Football as well. I'd just really like to ask you what you think the impact will be for football in this country, with people like Tom deciding no longer to write about the game.
I think it's huge, and I don't say that lightly. We've seen a situation now where a number of journalists are walking away from the game because of the impact of COVID-19, and another name to throw in the mix there is David Davutovic, who was a very prominent writer for the Herald Sun down in Melbourne, and also a very prominent figure in the greater sporting landscape when it comes to journalism. So I was really saddened to hear that Tom would be leaving. He's such a well-respected figure. He's broken so many important stories and exclusives over the years. I mean, he said himself he's been there for 15 years. So what you're taking out of the game now is 15 years of knowledge, 15 years of contacts and relationships that have been built up over that time, and a rapport with coaches and players, administrators. You know, it's a big loss for us. And I put up a tweet and said myself, you know, I'm glad to hear that it's by his own hand. He admitted that it was something that he had taken upon himself, but I don't doubt that the current environment hasn't made it conducive enough for a lot of employees, particularly in the media space, to keep their jobs. So I feel for Tom, I feel for David. I mean, I know that David's moved on and he's picked up another role with a new organisation called Ticker, but to not have these people contributing in the newspaper and the online space is a real loss for us. And I worry about how things are going to be reported in future, because you're now expecting others to come in and establish these relationships with you know, all the key stakeholders in the game, and are they going to be able to do it justice? I think that we as journalists, particularly now, have to make it incumbent upon ourselves to realise just how critical good quality reporting is. So I'm pretty saddened to hear the news, and I certainly hope that we don't see more, but I'm being told in the background that we potentially could see some other big names walking away.
And that's obviously a blow. I mean, I know there's new websites and new reporters coming out, and, you know, I don't want to sort of push any names in particular, but one website that's based in Melbourne is one called Soccer Scene, and I know that they've done a number of different pieces on the football industry as well. But you're right, you know, I think it's a blow to lose people like Tom and like Ray, and you know, we obviously wish them all the very best and whatever it is they decide to do moving forward. Just for those attendees that are on both Zoom and Facebook, if you want to ask Lucy a question, please feel free to do so. Put the details down on the chat, and the more questions we get, the less you have to hear a Scottish voice talking. So the questions are going to come from you guys, not from me. I will kick off as always, and then it's over to you. So Lucy, more topical questions. We seem to be, based on the reporting that we've heard, in the front running for the Women's World Cup in 2023. What do you think this would mean to football as a general in this country, but more specifically to the women's game over here?
It would be huge across both fronts. You know, when we consider the impact that hosting a tournament of this magnitude would have on us here as a nation, who once, a few years ago, aspired to host the men's tournament here, you can't underestimate just how important that would be. As for the impact for the women's game, I mean, we're already seeing it on such a huge upward trajectory. And I'm so proud of the strides that the women's game has made in recent years, because you only have to reflect on sort of the 2015 World Cup and post that, the drama that ensued with players going on strike and demanding more. You know, I stood in Hyde Park and watched players like Katrina Gorry cry to me saying that she couldn't afford to pay her rent and that was considering having to retire from football. I mean, these are some of the advancements that we've made, because we've ended up in a situation where a certain bracket of players within the Matilda squad now will be earning the same as the men's in the Socceroos. So that's a really important advancement. But, you know, from a participant's base, and so many of you here joining us today could speak to that, you know, coaching in that space, in the, you know, the junior girls space is starting to really take off. And I've been delighted to see it, because it means that young girls are starting to recognise that there is a pathway and that there is a potential career that waits for them in football. And that's the one thing that we've all been striving for so long, is to give these girls an opportunity to realise that they can make a career out of this, and for all the sacrifices that they make, that there is a reward at the end of that. So there are a huge amount of benefits from hosting the tournament here to pushing women's football into the stratosphere here in the country, which I think is really important.
I just hope that the border restrictions are going to be lifted before the World Cup kicks off. I can only imagine if that doesn't happen.
Brisbane, and I think it's also, you've got Adelaide as well. You know, there's some nervousness around lifting the borders, but, you know, I'm hoping that the light is at the end of the tunnel there, because we're already starting to see the restrictions ease. And, you know, if they can lift them by the time that rolls around, that'd be a nice thing.
No, that'd be good. Just with that in mind, then, obviously with the women's game and what have you, who do you think, and I know this is going to be an opinion only, and I'm not certainly asking you to make any sort of commitment here, but who do you think would be the right person, or indeed the right type of person, to take the head coach role of the Matildas for that World Cup?
It's a really hard question to answer, because, I mean, I've seen some news reports come out in recent weeks from one of our resident journos, Dave Lewis at SBS, who said that apparently there are rumours that Ante Milicic would potentially like to stay on. Now, that entirely conflicts with what's going on with his role over at MacArthur, of which I'm told from sources very close to the discussion that he has a watertight contract and that there would be no intentions for him to walk away from his role at MacArthur. But, I mean, look, that's up for debate. I certainly don't know the hard word on that, but that's only what I'm hearing, and it's what I can report. But ultimately, I think if Ante did want to stay on, it would be a good project for him to try and see it out. He's already been thrust into a really difficult scenario post the scandal that was the Alan Stajcic sacking, and was put into a very tough spot, because he had to take the team to a tournament within, what was it, 5 months, and try to get a result out of it. So for him to try and see that out, I think it would be perhaps something really special for him. But at the same time, I think that if he does walk away from the role, that opens up an opportunity for several other coaches. You know, I spoke to Joe Montemurro, who's doing fantastic things over with the Arsenal women's team over in the UK, who reportedly was never offered the Matildas gig when it was up for grabs at that time. But, you know, he has been courted by the USA. I think there are rumours doing the rounds now that he's being linked to the England job. So he's somebody that could certainly step up and take that role if that was something that he was interested in pursuing. But, you know, who else is out there? You know, we talk about promoting our own from within, and I think that's important too. So are there female coaches out there that could potentially be deserving of the job? You know, I think ideally it would be great to see a woman in that space, because I know that there are a number of ambitious coaches. You've got Heather Garriock as well, who's doing good things with Canberra United. Then you've also got the likes of Joey Peters, who we've worked with on our World Cup coverage multiple times, who has very strong and analytical views of the game and understands it intricately from that youth development level right up to seniors. So she's someone that is an ex-Matilda that has an array of experience that could add a lot to that role. So it's one of those things where, again, who is available and who would be interested in taking the position? Well, there are a number of them, but it's all about who's the right person for the job.
Just on the World Cup, and I you know, I know that I hope we win it. I really do. I want to go back to, if I may, the 2018 World Cup, where you received some really harsh criticism And I remember when Foz came out, and I was watching it on TV, and I actually became quite emotional at the way that he defended the terrible abuse that you took. But I think it's made you a stronger. I think it's made you a stronger person, and I think it's made you a more robust person broadcasting. But I want to ask you, how did it make you feel then, and how do you feel about things now?
Well, firstly, thanks for your kind words, James. I really appreciate that. I mean, I truly believe that as a host, you're only as good as the panelists that surround you. And quite frankly, I think that Craig Foster is the best sporting analyst of any code in the country. So he makes my job incredibly easy. So I was really delighted that I got to share that experience with him, and you know, across my 7-year career with SBS, that I've been able to work with him. But you know, a lot of people ask me about it and how I feel. And one of the funny things was that I escaped all of the controversy, all of the drama, all of the hatred and abuse that I copped, because I simply chose not to look at my social media. I mean, I learned some harsh lessons out of the 2014 World Cup, which was my first tournament that I hosted of that magnitude, where I did see a lot of the comments. And look, the reality is in TV, you're always going to cop it. I'm certainly not a wallflower by any stretch of the imagination. I've always had strong opinions, and I've always thought that when I came into this role, I wanted to be myself and stay true to that, and my heritage as well, and speaking a number of different languages. I also understand the importance of respecting, you know, people of different nationalities. We're such a vastly multicultural country here in Australia, but there's so much racism that's prevalent within the community that it's almost shocking, because we shouldn't be. And I think it's almost, you know, a crime what's going on at the moment when you consider everything happening globally, that racism still is an issue. But, you know, when it came to this, I didn't see any of the abuse. I simply kind of started reading some messages from friends and family back home who said, you know, don't worry about it, just keep your head up, ignore the stuff. And I was like, ignore what? What's happening? And I got a call from the publicist who said, look, this is blown up. And I said, well, what's blown up? And she told me about it. And I said, well, what's the problem? And she said, I don't know what the problem is. You pronouncing players' names correctly, that's the problem. And I said, well, if that's a problem, then, you know, I don't know what else to say, and I don't know what else to add to this discussion, because I haven't changed since I came into the role 7 years ago. And it certainly wasn't a topic of conversation at the 2014 World Cup. So it was really bizarre to me that it had come up at the 2018 tournament. And it's something that Les had been doing in his entire career, and had made a point to make sure that both he and everyone else that came through the halls at SBS understood why we did what we did. So I managed to escape any of that hatred, which was a real relief for me, because it meant that I got to just really enjoy the tournament. You know, I was absolutely shitting myself. I was a young girl when I was going into the 2014 tournament, and I just kept worrying about doing a good job. Whereas this time, I got to enjoy the spectacle. You know, it was just all about enjoying the games and feeling the atmosphere and soaking all of that up, and working with one of my great mates in Foz, and reconnecting with people like David Zelic, who used to work with us many years ago at SBS and is doing wonderful things over in the MLS now, has just taken up a role with Chicago Fire. So, you know, it was a wonderful experience for me, but I think it gave us the opportunity to educate the audience about why we do what we do. And when Foz mentioned it that fateful day in that video that everyone ended up seeing, and he got quite emotional. I had no idea actually that he was going to bring it up that day. So we hadn't spoken about it. I didn't want to mention it. I just thought, I'm not going to even bother addressing it. I just want to get on with the football. And when he brought it up, to see him, because he's one of my really good friends, to see him get emotional, that made me emotional. I'm that type of person. If you start crying now, James Boyle, I'll cry with you. Likewise, Karen, Laz, I'll do the same. Gary is tuning in, Martin, I'll do the same. I'll start crying with you. So that was hard for me to see him affected in that way. But, you know, I'm glad that we got to have that conversation, because it really started to set the record straight on who we are at SBS and why we service the communities in the way that we do, because we feel that they deserve to have the respect that we give them, and that certainly the entire nation should do the same.
I think that, you know, my own personal opinion, and not really, doesn't really count for much, but I think because he actually pronounced the names as well, if not better, than Les, God rest his soul, that may have been the sort of, you know, the issue, that no one was supposed to do it as good as him. But you obviously did, and maybe that was the reason. But, you know, that was then, this is now. You did mention that you have quite an opinion. You know, you're not shy, you're no wallflower. Yeah, and one of the things that you've done recently is you have voiced your opinions on the game in this country. I'd just like you to quickly summarise, if you would, what your feeling is in the game in this country, from grassroots all the way through to the A-League, and what you feel as, you know, a very important personality in the game, what you feel has to change in order to bring the game up to the next level.
Oh, they're both really loaded questions, but to summarise how I feel from the professional game right through to the grassroots, I think that I could best express it in one word, which is disenchantment. And I think that speaks to the wider football community in the country, is that we're all feeling incredibly frustrated by everything that we're seeing play out. And I think that these aren't new issues. These are things that we've been battling for many, many years. And in fact, we've been having the same conversations on certain subjects for over 30 years. I mean, when you consider it in that respect, it's pretty disgraceful, isn't it, that we haven't managed to advance in all this time, that we haven't managed to reach a point where we have identified the real issues and the areas of the game that are fractured and repair them. That's a real concern for me. But, you know, I think people are understandably starting to get jack of the fact that we continue to run around in circles and that we haven't been able to make the advancements that I spoke of. Some of the real things that I've been vocal about are the way that the game is run, and that concerns all tiers of the game, right through to the grassroots. You know, this real issue of the cost of play. And I know that a lot of people have come out and broken these figures down and sort of stipulated that, well, actually, you know, when you do break it across the season, we're not asking all that much of people. But when you cast your minds back to when we were young kids growing up, and certainly when my brothers were growing up and playing football, they weren't being asked to pay exorbitant fees. You know, what parent back then, especially a lot of the migrants that had come to Australia with young children who had ambitions and aspirations to become successful footballers, would have been able to afford $2,500 for their child that was aged under 6. I mean, that's catastrophic to me. And people will counter that and say, well, now we've got more experienced coaches. Now we're investing more in our coaching pathways and making sure that they're educated in a way that aligns with obviously the Asian Football Confederation. And it's something, though, that I then counter and say, well, hang on a second, our Asian Football Confederation badges aren't recognised globally. I mean, Kevin Muscat had to turn around, and his position with his club over in Belgium was delayed because he then had to go and complete his other coaching badges. So, you know, that's another worry for me too. And if you want to talk about the investment that's been made in coaches, well, some of the golden generation, a lot of the quality footballers that were produced through that NSL era, they didn't go through these coaching badges. They didn't have to go through all these rigors and hoops that we're asking people to jump through now. So there are a lot of issues with the game. Cost of play is one of them. You know, again, the disenchantment amongst the fans within the professional game. You know, crowd attendances are low. People aren't tuning in anymore. Why are these things? Is it as simple as, well, we don't have big names and big marquees that are attracting bums on seats? Or is it one of those things where there's no connection for fans? And that's a hard subject to broach as well, because there are a lot of people that are from the NSL era that will say, well, we have no reason to support the clubs in the A-League. That's why we don't come to the games. But, you know, we're still a new league. So where we have been very critical of things that have gone on in the last 15 years within the A-League, we also have to understand that perhaps we're asking for a bit too much too soon. So, you know, all of these clubs, you know, when you look at major leagues around the world, the likes of Liverpool and Everton, they had to start somewhere too, didn't they? So it's the same for your Sydney FCs and your Western Sydney Wanderers. You know, one of the other issues that I have when it comes to the professional game is this issue of expansion. You know, have we gotten it right over the years? Certainly not. I'm hoping that we can get it right, but where we are now, you know, were these the best decisions? Were these the best teams that were the right fit for the competition when the new board came in 2018? My answer to that is no. And I've seen the data, I've seen the metrics, and I've seen papers that concern, you know, the figures and the facts around, you know, which teams were actually best placed to be given the expansion licenses. And I'll tell you right now, they weren't Western United and they weren't MacArthur. So if they weren't those teams, why were they awarded those licenses? You know, these are some real concerns for me. And I think that coupled with all the disenchantment around the state of the game, these are factors that have pushed fans to the edge. They've pushed stakeholders like Fox Sports to the edge. I mean, this is a game that's been neglected for so many years. Simple things like marketing it. You know, we should be jamming these players and these profiles and identities down the throats of the Australian public. I'll tell you now, I don't watch MasterChef, but I'd be able to rattle off a series of the contestants, because you turn on the radio, you turn on the television, you open the paper, this is all that we're seeing as just an example. But when it comes to the coverage of the game, when it comes to the promotion of it, it's certainly very difficult to to kind of promote it behind a paywall and have it on Fox Sports. But again, this is a broadcast that it's invested in the game for 15 years at a time when it's been neglected by the previous regime at the governing body, who I don't think did a good enough job of servicing it, to quite frankly. It's raised many questions for me around, well, can the CEO of FFA affect any great change? I reached out to David Gallup recently, and I wanted to connect with him to find out what were some of the major challenges and issues that he identified in his time within the sport. And to be fair, I was quite critical of his time there because I think, number one, it warranted it. But number two, we didn't have the greatest of relationships because I was always quite critical of FFA. He declined the opportunity, respectfully speaking. He was very polite in his response back to me. But, one thing I did realise when David Gallup left was that I think the CEO is essentially the scapegoat for all of the sport's problems. So I feel immensely for James Johnson coming into this because he has arrived in such a, pardon the language, a shitstorm, hasn't he? He's inherited such a disaster. And this whole series of events, with the pandemic breaking out, it hasn't unearthed all of these problems. They've always been there, but what it's done is thrust them into the spotlight, which is why we're all talking about them at length now. So, these are just a sample of some of the problems with the game. Another one that's been that's caused a real bee to exist under my bonnet is the role of member federations. We spoke to Peter Philopoulos, and I continue to speak to a lot of the other member federations about their roles and how they see their contributions in Australian football playing out over the next few months and years. And you're not going to get, as Rob Sherman has been quoted as saying, you're not going to get the turkeys to vote for Christmas. So none of them are going to put their hands up and say, okay, yeah, actually, happily come and wield the axe and the member federations will be disbanded and we'll all operate under this one unitary model. But when I spoke to James Johnson about it, I said, well, how do you see the roles of the member federations? And he said, well, look, to be quite honest, is the solution to all of this to get rid of them? And he said, my answer to that is no. But do we need to streamline the processes and how they work and our relationship with them? He said, yes. But my subsequent question to that and to everybody here is, how do we streamline those processes? How do we get them to start operating better and to start communicating with one another that aligns with the game in the country, that aligns with the whole of football plan? At this point, they're all rowing in their own direction and deciding their own mandate and walking to the beat of their own drum, which is not servicing the game. And I think it's a real problem and it's something that we need to explore. But the solutions to that, I've always said, and certainly Foz has been a big advocate of this also, is a unitary model. I think that those member federations should be disbanded and that we should have everybody operating under the one umbrella.
And I'll tell you, your comments there are not too dissimilar to a conversation we had 3 weeks ago with Simon Hill, where Simon made the same statement. And indeed, he made it 2 weeks ago when asking Anton Isaac the very same question. So, there's a lot of different things that could happen. We're getting the questions coming through thick and fast, Lucy. So I have a couple more. I'm going to put them to the end. I do want to quickly bring in Mel Patsfield, who has asked if you can just make a comment on your statement just there. So if you bear with me just a second, I'm just going to unmute Mel. And Mel, you'll be on with Lucy as soon as you unmute yourself, sir. Technology. Mel, you're on.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Thanks for being here, Lucy. I just wanted to quickly comment on that. In fact, on the discussion that we had with Anta a few weeks ago, I actually wanted to post a fact check on your LinkedIn page, James, because it was around about the 35th or 39th minute of the conversation. Anta basically threw a throwaway line in there, and it was the fact that apparently Germany has 263 stakeholders, so we can't be really doing that bad. Now, I don't know if you know my background. I lived and played and worked in Germany for about 18 years. I know the Bundesliga like the back of my hand. There are, in fact, only, there's a DFL in Germany, which represents all the clubs in the first and second division. And then there's the DFB, which represents all the other clubs, including the third division, which is semi-professional, and all the other clubs beneath that. and the DFB basically consists of the 21 state federations. However, they've actually consolidated those into 5 regions. So realistically in Germany, you've only got the DFL and you've got the 5 regions. So I don't know where Anta was getting his information from, but that is totally wrong. And we're talking an organisation which is ranked as the largest sporting organisation in the world. They're represented basically by 7 stakeholders, and we've got, well, I guess all of the federations, and each of the clubs gets their own say as well. We are over-governed, and I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. It's about cutting through that red tape. I mean, that's the biggest problem in the game. And when we consider what's going on with youth development, I mean, that's another issue that's been a hot topic of conversation. Why aren't we producing players at the rate that we used to? I'm certainly no expert on youth development. That's well with our, out of my scope of qualifications. But, I listen to a lot of people talk about it, and I listen to some of the issues that they're coming up against. And, a lot of it is cost to play. A lot of it is relying on these member federations to be able to develop these players to the best of their abilities. What markers and measures are we putting in place to ensure that that's happening, and that we're all developing in a way that's consistent with what we believe to be our footballing philosophy? I mean, in Australia, what would you identify as our football philosophy? What is our identity overall? What is it that we're trying to do? And I've had a conversation with Rob Sherman about it, and I respectfully said to him, Rob, so many of us that would think that the national curriculum wasn't worth the paper that it was written on. And I'm saying that as respectfully as I possibly can. And he admitted to me that there were a lot of issues with it, and certainly the way in which it was articulated and explained to coaches who continue to bang their heads against the wall over the state that that's in, and the way that it needs to be interpreted. There are a lot of holes in that. But Rob will tell you, he lasted in the role for 9 months and walked away because he couldn't affect the change that he wanted to. And one of the things that he cited that was one of the biggest problems was his dealings with member federations. Too much red tape. It goes back to what Mel was saying. The game is over-governed. And, in a population like ours, where grassroots participation is the highest and most popular in the country, we shouldn't be in this situation. It's almost embarrassing that we can't get our act together. And it hurts me to say that, because for everybody here and for all those involved in the broader football community, we want to see Australia do well. We have so much potential. We certainly do. And look at all the experience that we've garnered and that we've managed to produce over the years, these talented players that are only now coming into the frame and having a view on things. I think it's really important. But Mel, for him, experience over in Germany for over 18 years, why aren't we reaching out to Mel and saying, Mel, what can we learn from the German model over there? Because it's run so effectively. And what are some of the things that we can implement here in Australia to improve the game? We have this real arrogance, and we adopted so much from the Dutch. And where did that get us? We had this massive obsession with Hus Hiddink all those years, but we haven't seen or reaped the benefits of that since then. And the Dutch philosophy, football is cyclical, right? So we saw what happened to them at the World Cup in 2018. They didn't even qualify. So, we've got to start thinking about developing our own identity and leaning into the experience that we already have here rather than looking out.
Do not disagree with anything that you've said there. I think that, coming from Scotland 10 years ago, I've seen a lot of different things on the way the philosophy is, and I've done my badges over here, and there's a few people on here that have done their badges here and over in the UK. You touched on Kevin Muscat earlier on. Kevin had to go back to Belgium and reset another license to allow him to coach over there because of the way the game is. I take Mel's point totally on board. I do think personally, I've got an opinion as well. I think the game is over-governed. I think there's too many people that are running separately on things. But I'm just a quiet voice. But when you've got people like Mel Partsvold and Gary Cole and Karen Gregor who actually can make a difference and who have done so much in the game up until now, for those voices not to be heard, you've got to ask the question why. You've got to ask the question why. Next question, Mel, thank you for that. Next question is going to come from Karen Gregor. So I'm just going to unmute Karen. She's got a question that she's wanting to ask you, Lucy. So Karen, on you go.
Okay, Lucy, this is This is probably a little bit of an easier one now, so you can draw breath on this one. Look, just who have been your mentors? I mean, I think you might have answered it a bit earlier when you spoke about Les, and then you spoke about Foz and things like that. But who have you sort of admired in the media broadcasting, and you thought, you know, that's someone who I want to be like? And then I guess the second part is, has there been a time in a game when you had to really sort of remember that you were a broadcaster and not just a fan, because of the game itself, you know, whether it was at the World Cup or even some other smaller game. But just, you know, you are a very passionate person. So where was there a time when that line was kind of like you had to draw it?
Oh, almost every time I cover a Liverpool game or a Croatia game. That's the biggest problem for me. It's a great question, Karen. It's one I haven't been asked before. I'll answer that one and then I'll go back to your mentor one. Yeah, it was really difficult for me at the most recent World Cup in 2018, obviously being of Croatian heritage and having strong connections to that. That was rough. And I was so emotional. You know, Croatia bloody made it hard for us going through that tournament. Every time they had to go to extra time and then penalties. It was just laborious. They were killing us. All the Croatians back home were going absolutely mental, including my family. But, you know, that was challenging because I had to try and remove my emotion out of it and just look at it on face value as the game. And I remember I've spoken to Martin Tyler, who's obviously a great friend of ours here at SBS, has covered many World Cups with us and is a friend of mine. I chatted with him recently and I asked him that same question about when he covers England games, and he's very diplomatic. He said, no, Lucy, I just look at it as the football and I try to steer clear of having any emotional investment in it. But as a result, when you listen to Martin commentate England games, he's almost completely devoid of any emotion entirely. He's sucked the soul out of himself because he's trying so hard not to get involved in the England game. I think one of the strengths of any broadcaster is that they are passionate about the game. And I think you have to be in order to be involved. If you're not passionate about the subject matter, get the hell out. We don't need you here. And you're not going to survive either, because football is, you know, it's the kind of sport that will chew you up and spit you out. So unless you really are committed to the cause, you won't last long. But I remember actually for the 2018 tournament, I started crying a lot when I could see that Croatia was about to lose, and the makeup artists were coming in, and I remember the producer in my ear saying, you know, you got to get it together, mate. And I said, yeah, I'm fine. I'll just give me a minute. I'll get my head straight and I'll get onto it. And talking about France and their achievement and how they'd won, it tasted like poison coming out of my mouth. So that was really rough. But where it was tough once in particular was when Liverpool lost the Champions League final a couple of years ago. And that was tragic. Bloody Loris Karius. I still want to hang that man up by a pole somewhere because he just absolutely destroyed us in that game. But yeah, I actually started, and we had Craig Johnson on air with us, and I felt the tears start to come down my face as I was interviewing him and talking to him on the panel. And I remember I could hear my producer saying, you've got to get it together, you've got to get it together. And so that whole time he's talking, I'm just sort of subtly wiping the tears off my face. So it is really hard. And I'm the type of person, I wear my heart on my sleeve. What I think I'll tell you, I'm very honest and very raw. So it has certainly been a challenge over my time in the gig, that's for sure. As for mentors, you listed them there, Les and Foz, without a doubt. You know, when I was having real difficulties with sort of coming to terms with any sort of grief on social media in the early stages when I started SBS, I remember Les and I were sitting outside having a cigarette. I don't smoke anymore, for those that would be ready to judge. But we were both sharing a dirty cigarette out in the courtyard, which we did many, many times. And he said, oh, Luce, please, people are telling me to die, that I'm past my expiry date. I've heard it all before. And he said, you'll continue to hear it too. So just learn to tune it out. And that's what I did. And it was probably the best advice I'd been given. Foz, you know, in addition to being, you know, somebody that I value, admire and respect tremendously for his contributions on the field, as well as off the field, which I think have just been equally as impressive. You know, he's someone that I really like being in the company of. You know, we talk almost every day, a couple of times a day. He's effectively my work husband, you know, but I admire him for so many reasons, and he's taught me so much. Just listening to him as he talks throughout game coverage has taught me a lot. He certainly educated me about a lot of aspects of the game and encouraged me to want to pursue further avenues when it comes to increasing my knowledge around the game. So I'm always looking to learn more. I'm always looking to be educated when it comes to that, because I think as a journalist and someone that covers the game, you have to know. And, you know, you only have to look at other leagues around the world. You know, the journalists in Italy, they'll stone you to death in a press conference, metaphorically speaking, because they understand the game very intricately. And I think it's incumbent on us as journalists in Australia to really up our game when it comes to that as well. So one other guy that I failed to mention was Stuart Randall, who was my executive producer. He's since left us and working at ESPN, but he had a great way of providing constructive feedback. And I think that's really important in any position, whether you're a coach and you're providing feedback to your players, you have to do it in a way that's going to appeal to them and that they're going to understand and that will resonate with them. So he certainly understood how to push my buttons, but in a way that would inspire me to walk away and want to be better and not bang my head against the wall and feel like I was, you know, the lowest of the low, because I've made so many mistakes. I made a shit ton of mistakes at the World Cup. I make a mistake in a broadcast. That's life. That happens, you know, and you can't expect to have a perfect broadcast every time. And I've let go of all of that. But the reality is, like I said, as long as you've got that love for the game and you've got the base knowledge there, that's the sort of stuff that will see you through.
Good answer.
You can't teach passion, can you? Next, we're going to have Socceroo, Gary Cole. When you go, mate, I know you've got a question for Lucy. You just put his camera on.
Hey, Lucy, how you going? Thanks for coming on. Great to see you. Just wondering, Ned's history in the game and his love, his practicing in the backyard in Canberra and the journey through the AIS, when I was also coaching them with Smudger, is well documented. I'm wondering whether that was a part of your love for the game, where your love for the game came from, and how that grew and developed.
It certainly came via the family's obsession with football overall, to be honest. I mean, there's almost 15 years between Ned and I. So by the time that his career had started to reach a point where he was breaking out onto the scene and going through the rigors of the Australian Institute of Sport and then graduating from there and playing in the NSL, I was still far too young. Where my love really developed, Gaz, was through my relationship with my other brother, Ivan, who's some years younger than him, but 8 years older than I am. So for me, it was playing in the backyard with him. You know, he basically, my dad was a builder, has retired since, but he'd have all this old wood lying around the house. And so Ivan would construct makeshift goals. And when he went to the Australian Institute of Sport, I mean, he'd probably kill me for admitting it now, but he used to steal the nets, some of the nets after the training sessions, and bring them home and put them over these goals. And he would make me wear a proper football jersey and stand in goals. And he took it so seriously. We'd do double or nothing bets. I mean, you name it. I ended up with so many black eyes, blood noses, bruised shins. That was all I ever knew as a kid growing up. So when people ask me about my childhood, it wasn't playing with dolls and Barbies. That came later. Yeah. It was just being out in the backyard and just enjoying the game and loving the game. I think that's something that really lacks right now when we talk about, you know, young kids coming through. There are so many different distractions that they're having to deal with: iPads, social media, you know, PlayStations, all this kind of garbage that we didn't have to face back in that day. So all you had was the ball in the backyard to play with and enjoy. And my dad was the type of guy, you know, growing up in this household, they were never, the male figures in our house, they were never the type to say, oh, you're just a girl, get out of the way, or you can't get involved. They encouraged you to get involved, which I think is really important. So there was always a space at the table for anyone that wanted to be involved in the game and kicking it around. And that's where the real love came from. And sitting in the car with my dad, listening to Croatian music, going to the boys' training sessions. Ivan was so embarrassed when he was at the AIS. I used to run amok, and he reckons that one day I started belting out heavy metal songs in the background while the guys were in training. I mean, that's all I knew. But then, you know, in a stark contrast, my sister, she can't stand the game. She's got no interest in it because she is 2 years younger than Ned and was dragged to every game, every training session. I think she's probably a bit on the resentment side because she feels as though that sort of dominated and consumed her whole being. Whereas for me, it was just a nice introduction to something that I still love very much to this day.
Good on you, mate. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Laz, you've got a couple of questions you want to ask to Lucy, so I think you two know each other, right?
Yeah, thanks for joining, Lucy.
Laz?
Just a couple of themes that I took out and just got questions around. Firstly, how well do we feel that the Matildas are placed to aim for a top 4 finish should we host the World Cup as well? Because that'll take on extra significance if, you know, so the focus is obviously 2023 irrespective of where it's played, but should we host it, that'll take on even greater significance. So did you want to share your thoughts on that first?
I think we certainly should aim for top four. There's no reason why we shouldn't. Prior to us going to the 2019 tournament in France, I'd certainly let myself get carried away with this belief and this desire potentially that we could win the tournament. But there were a lot of women involved in the game at the time. And I remember Jo Peters being one of them on air saying, you need to calm down. Just don't put too much pressure on them, because whilst it is great that we've made all these advancements and that we've reached sixth, in the world, we've still got a while to go. And at that time, I think leading into the tournament, there are a couple of concerns certainly that I'd identified when I'd watched us play against the likes of France and England, where I thought, oh, we're looking very vulnerable and we look quite exposed. At that time, I think one of the players had come out and said, when we played against France, who I think is such a dynamic footballing nation, they're so fabulous to watch. And I actually tipped them to win the bloody tournament, and not discounting the fact that the USA is such a powerhouse. But, the player had come out at the time, I think it was Mackenzie Arnold, said, oh, we haven't been prepared to play against a back three. And I went, oh, shit, that's a worry, because if we're not preparing to play against all types of formations and systems, then, we need to get a reality check and a wake-up call, because there are other nations that are advancing a lot quicker than what we are. So I think for us, it was a dose of reality at the tournament. A lot of people raised questions saying, well, if Stage was there, could we have achieved more? Maybe. I think that the disruptions and the displacement of everything added to the issues that plagued the team going into the tournament. But I think that they gave everything that they had. And ultimately, it gave us a real reality check in terms of where we're placed now globally and what we need to do to advance to that next level. But we certainly should be aiming for a top four finish. And when it comes to hosting the tournament, that is going to add significant pressure without a doubt. But we've got the time now. We're going to find out in the next 14 days or so whether or not we've secured the tournament here across Australia and New Zealand. And that gives us time to work on, okay, are we going to retain Ante Milicic? Is that something that he wants to do? Does he want to stay on? Or do we go out and find the best possible coach and make sure that this team have their shit together and that everybody at the governing body understands what they need to support that ambition?
Yeah, I think there's just on that. I think there's a lack of focus on that last point that you just raised. That's what it seems like just from the outside, that there isn't enough focus on trying to get that. Great to host it, fantastic, but like you said, we need to get it all together. The second question that I had was, how do we address the lack of connection between the tiers of football? So the football family, or what we call the football family, and the concept of Euro snobbery, that our league isn't considered good quality, because that's, that is where I see it. Marketing alone isn't just going to fix it. It's the football family's perception of, hey, what's being dished up is not quality, but we've got to try and gender a sense of attachment to the game and say, hey, we're all football people. Let's go out and support our league.
It's a hard question to answer because I've heard so much conjecture around that very subject. And for years, all you hear is people saying, well, the A-League quality, it's terrible. It's not worth going to watch. So I'm not going to join that bandwagon. And yes, the Euro snobbery comes into it, where they say, well, it doesn't compare to Europe, and I'd rather watch the Premier League. I'd rather watch this. And what I say to those people is, how are we ever going to be able to compete with those leagues around the world? We can't. So we have to stop comparing apples with oranges and expect that we're going to turn up to Bankwest Stadium and we're going to see the likes of Bayern or Leicester or Liverpool or Manchester City play. That's not going to happen. That's why those leagues exist. And when you want to watch those leagues, you can. It doesn't mean that we can't watch the A-League. It doesn't mean that we can't support the A-League. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier, that massive disconnect between the fans and the clubs. I know for a fact, and from speaking to Corey, who's been at various clubs, who's my partner, from speaking to players, from speaking to coaches, media managers as well, they're all involved in this. What is being done at the clubland level to try and establish that connection between the fans and the overall footballing community at that club? Not enough. Are the players going out and connecting with schools? Are they going out and doing enough, within the local footballing associations within their respective states to encourage those young kids to come along to A-League games? The answer to that is no. And it's really appalling when you consider the AFL, who I've got no interest in AFL, I don't have any desire to watch it. But one thing that I will say is that that is a sport that is very well governed and very well run and understands how to administer a sport and to basically attract an audience. That's what we don't do. They will send players, lads, out to schools armed with a couple of tickets each and say, come along to our games. What happens? Of course, the kids go home, say to mum and dad, oh, by the way, one of the Carlton players gave me 2 tickets to their games. And the parents say, well, hang on a second, what about your sister and your brother? We've got to get them involved. So they get everyone to go along to the games, and that's how that connection starts. I don't think we treat the fans and the participants at the grassroots level with enough respect. We don't understand that they are the ones that are going to be filling the stadiums, that they're the ones that are going to be the long-term fans of these football clubs. That's a real problem. How is it that I can understand that? I don't have a degree in business, and everyone here understands that, but the governing body doesn't. The powers that be don't. The clubs don't. So more needs to be done at that level to establish that long-term, lifelong relationship. You know, I support Liverpool. I've never, ever been to Anfield, you know, but I will get up to watch them at all ungodly hours of the night, cry when they lose a Champions League game, and support them until I die, and tell my daughter she has to support them as well. You know, how is it that a club in a foreign country has been able to capture me, but here locally we cannot establish that between kids that are growing up in these cities and for whatever reason choosing not to go to the games because their parents are disenchanted with it? You know, let's take a look at, for example, how much we're charging these kids and families and parents to go to these games. That's a massive problem. You know, in my view, any child under the age of 12 should be able to go to these football games for free. All right, it's already a struggling competition. We need bums on seats. We need to capture the imagination of these fans and give them a reason to come. And it doesn't come in the form of Star Wars round or Spanish round or whatever else has been constructed to try and do that. People will come to the games if you put on quality football matches. And so much of that comes down to also, I believe, promoting local talent. You know, we're getting all these foreigners coming into the league who are here for a payday, let's be honest. And if they were that good quality, and I'm not saying that we haven't had good quality, my gosh, look at the likes of Diego Castro, look at Thomas Broich. I mean, we've had some phenomenal names, Alessandro Del Piero, Emil Heskey. We've had big marquees come to Australia and add so much value. But for the ones that haven't, they've come here, they've filled up the salary cap and gone back to some other league around the world, and we've never heard from them again. In my view, now post the pandemic, where the salary cap and salaries are going to be pretty tight in general, start giving local talent an opportunity, start giving youth an opportunity. And I'll guarantee you that people will come to watch because they've got a reason to. There's a connection to these players rather than seeing these foreigners come in and take up unnecessary spots and give us, you know, an empty and soulless competition.
Preach it. That's it.
Just on that topic, Lucy, and this is something, there's a couple more questions that have come through, but I want to ask you this one, and this isn't just in your opinion. Do you think we should invest in players and youth in Australian football, or should we invest in facilities to attract players to the game and then have them coached properly?
I worry about that one. I worry about the latter, simply because what we're doing then is we're trusting clubs and people who probably don't have the best resources to develop these players. You know, we've heard a lot about the ex-golden generation players coming out and talking with great admiration about their time at the Australian Institute of Sport. And I sat back and I thought, okay, a lot of them are advocating for the AIS and for the return of it, but is that the be-all and end-all of our problems? I don't think it is. I think when it comes to youth development, I think that we certainly have to identify that it is a problem, which it has already been done. So kudos to James Johnson and everybody involved that has recognised after all this time that we need to start addressing youth development. And again, he's only been in the role for just over 4 months now, so we've got to cut him some slack. But you know, my criticisms of it stem back to, you know, say post the golden generation era, when I spoke to Graham Arnold, who at the time, after 2006, had already issued a warning saying, we need to start thinking about our progression plan. Where are we going after this? Because this golden generation won't last forever. And we need to start considering where we're going to develop players. And it fell on deaf ears. It wasn't addressed at the time. And this is why we're in the situation that we're in. I know that there's been a very big dry spell when it comes to football. in terms of the length of the competition. So when you look at the National Youth League setup, it's such a short season. Kids aren't playing enough football. And that's ultimately what this comes down to. Speak to Smudger, as Gary Cole mentioned, Ron Smith, who's lauded by so many in this country as being a brilliant football brain, about what are the issues with youth development. Kids aren't playing enough. Their hours aren't up enough. So when you've got a system like that in place where it can take some parents. I mean, Corey's got the under 17 girls over at Football New South Wales. One of the mums is driving her daughter up from Wollongong every other day just to get her to play representative football. That's not good enough. Where are the proper pathways? Where's the accessibility when it comes to giving these kids an option to play? We don't do a good enough job of that. I mean, Zlatan Ibrahimovic just came out. There was a quote on ESPN that actually Ned incidentally retweeted, which was why I saw it, where he was slamming the cost of play over in America and saying that effectively you've got kids that if you want them to play, it's costing them $3,500 per child. That's ludicrous. That is absolutely ludicrous. You are pricing talented young children out of the game. We've become an elitist sport, and we can't act surprised when we're not developing players at the rate that we should be. So I've tried to answer your question in a roundabout way, but let me get to the crux of what you're saying, which is potentially then building the facilities. Guess what? We actually have the facilities. When you get foreigners that come to this country, all they do is take a look around and say, wow, look at all these open spaces. Look at all the fields that you have, the patches of grass that you have for kids to be able to play football on. It's that we're not using the facilities to the best of our abilities. That's my biggest concern. And when you consider what some of the A-League clubs are doing with their academies, I know that Sydney FC is starting to make some really positive steps and develop some really talented players that have come through their youth academies. I know that Melbourne Victory is starting to get on board with that as well, but not every club has a youth academy set up. Adelaide United, for example, don't. I spoke to Bruce Jitte recently, and they still, in spite of all of that, have managed to develop players like the Toure brothers, for example, who are doing really, really well and impressing everybody on the A-League front. So, these are things that we need to start thinking of. Is it worth moving back to an Australian Institute of Sport type model? Potentially. Is that going to solve all of our youth development issues? No. But what we need to start doing is making football more accessible for kids at the grassroots level and slashing those costs and improving the relationships, as I said before, between the member federations and getting them to understand that this isn't just about a cash grabbing exercise. It's about giving kids a chance to play and producing footballers that we can be proud of, that can have pathways in this country and potentially go on to do bigger and better things around the world.
It's funny that you mention that, because in 2 weeks' time, my guest on this is Peter Hugg, who's the head of football at Football New South Wales. And the guests that are on here, they'll know that over the last few weeks, one of the main topics of conversation that's been quite hot has been pathways and the academy structure and the fact that there isn't a pathway. And in 2 weeks' time, that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be discussing the pathways and the academy structure. So that is a very sort of tailored point, Lucy. And that'll be, I'm seeing some comments coming through on Facebook here. I've just had comments saying, Lucy for the FFA chairman. That's from Glenn Walker.
No way.
So,
Poison chalice, that job.
I think that's a fantastic call, Glenn. Well done for that. But just on that point, again, it's almost as if I'd written this previously, but I haven't, I promise. Martin Doherty has got a question for you just based on that. Martin, on you go, mate.
You've led me on there, Lucy. Love your passion, energy, enthusiasm and knowledge. It's brilliant. And I noticed you had a glass of water there as well to give yourself a breath. Well done.
I'm a talker. I'm sweating as well. It's all too much, Martin.
It's been absolutely superb and great to hear. Hopefully an easy question. I actually asked Simon this a couple of weeks ago. You're a tremendous presenter and panelist. Any reason why you're not coaching? Would you coach? And I was going to add that little bit on there. Would you consider going on the FFA board? But obviously you've already answered that question. But would you coach? Have you considered that?
No. And a lot of people have asked me actually why I didn't end up playing. And I'll tell you now, the genetics did not run through the chain. I am absolutely woeful. I can kick a ball. There's no problem with striking a ball. And I'm certainly a far better defender than I would be a striker. But I had no ambitions to play because I just love the game so much that I love to talk about it more than anything. So I think you can tell by now I could probably talk underwater, which was why fitting into this role was a far more suitable one than putting on a pair of boots. But one thing I am really passionate about is advancing my knowledge around the game. So Foz and I will routinely sit down and he'll actually start to take me through some exercises just around, you know, the basics. And it all years ago started with really simple stuff like ball possession, you know, all that BPO stuff and trying to understand systems and patterns of play. You know, I read a lot about the UEFA technical reports and I'm sure that quite a few of you would be aware of them, but they were really great and a fabulous introduction to start to get my head around statistics around the game and how you can start to see patterns evolving and what needs to happen, say, to create goal scoring opportunities. I mean, I'd like to consider myself a student of the game. I'm by no means a master, so there are always things to learn. But Corey and I, for example, we were down in Canberra the other week. I went down to visit family for the first time since the pandemic broke out to see them. And we just went to a cafe and sat down and he started to take me through some back five analysis, for example. I just find that stuff really fascinating. In addition to being very crucial to my job and needing to understand these things, I actually just enjoy having the game broken down and looking at it from that perspective. But I wouldn't make a great coach. And I think when it comes to the question of, you know, getting involved with, you know, the FFA board, I'd respectfully decline because in the current climate, and I know that Foz at his particular juncture in time had chosen to pursue a role and wanted to be chairman. And for reasons that, you know, I won't go into too much here today, but he decided to pull out because I think he'd reached a point where he realized that he couldn't affect the kind of change that he wanted to. And it was a smart move because I wouldn't want to go anywhere near the board if I knew that I couldn't actually implement positive change. And I know that that's their ambition. That's certainly what they've said throughout this whole time since the new board was implemented. But I just don't think that with the current infrastructure that the game has in place, the ecosystem of the game is not conducive to giving somebody an opportunity to exact great change. So until that changes, I certainly wouldn't want any part of it. And I really relish the role that I have in being able to hold those figures to account and call for better change from the outside. Because once you get sucked into that system, and I know a lot that have been there and that are still there. Once you get sucked into admin land, you tend to start to just speak the corporate lingo and you become one of them. So I want to retain my sense of self and my passion and my ability to call out things for how they are.
Good call. Thank you.
Just a quick reminder to those on Facebook Live and on Zoom, Lucy Zelic is here. She'll answer any questions that you have, so please feel free to put them in on the chat. Been a fantastic discussion so far. So just another question for you, Lucy. We spoke earlier on about the way in which the game is seen in this country, and you know we've got a high participation rate, but we don't have a lot of people going to the games, or it doesn't seem to get the exposure that it possibly should get, and certainly the exposure that it gets in other countries. Do you think James Johnson or the FFA should be lobbying the government for more money for the game? Or do you think that we have to be content where we are and sit behind the NRL, the AFL and cricket as number 4 sport? And I can see you nodding your head, so you've obviously got a passionate response on that one.
That's a trick question, isn't it? We should never be content. Never, ever should we be content with being behind the likes of AFL and NRL, because the fact is we are a global game. And yes, the reality that we are not at the top of the food chain in this country, I think, is the biggest crime in all of this, to be honest, James. Should we be lobbying the government? Absolutely. And I think that when we spoke to James Johnson, that was one of the things on my list. And both Foz and I had agreed it was a really important talking point to raise with him about the existing relationship that the governing body has with the government and what's going to be done in future to try and foster and nurture that so that we can potentially secure some much needed funding. He agreed that, yes, it does need some work and it hasn't had much love or care in the last few years, certainly. But he told me that the only government funding that we receive is to the tune of $3 million. $3 million. What's $3 million?
Really?
You know, I mean, that is shocking. When I heard that figure, I had to stop myself from, from shaking my head in disgust, because it's disturbing to think that after, again, all these years, after everything that we've strived to achieve in this game, after the plaudits that the government and everyone in the country that have handed over to the Matildas and the love that they've had for them, why we aren't able to generate more funding. You know, when the Matildas go to a tournament, everyone loves to get behind them. When the Socceroos go to the World Cup, everyone loves to get behind them, but we aren't able to translate that affection for our national teams into the wider community of the professional game and the grassroots itself. So we certainly need to be striving forward. And by we, I mean the governing body need to be working towards developing sounder relationships with the government. And that extends to just educating them on the way that the sport is followed and the way that it's supported. I mean, I know in Victoria, for example, when we were still doing the A-League over at SBS many years ago now, I was getting a vision from my cameraman saying, just take a look at the amount of police that are at this Melbourne derby. I'll tell you now, some really disturbing figures that do come out of these sort of seasons for us is that the amount of people, for example, that have been arrested in any one season, and this goes back a couple of years now that I've had this data, 3 people were arrested over the entire A-League season. Do you know that's about the same amount that gets arrested on average per AFL match? Right? So when you hear these figures and the tough ride that we get in the media for football hooliganism and flares that are being thrown and brawls that are breaking out, etc., stadium seats that are being broken, it does not compare by any stretch of the imagination to the kind of grief that goes on in AFL games and NRL games, and likewise extends to cricket. So we've received a really bum rap, and it's incumbent on the governing body to try and educate those within government and within the respective state bodies to understand what the game of football is about and how the government can benefit from having more supporters at the games and growing the profile of the sport overall, given that we do have the highest participation rate. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that government space. And we've been banging on about that for years now. And when you hear that figure, that $3 million figure, it only makes you shake your head.
Mel.
Oh, yes. Sorry, you just caught me off guard. That's my dog next to me. Hey, Carlos, stop it. Lucy, you were just talking about affecting growth. I think I read about 2 or 3 weeks ago that James Johnson came out and said that the FFA had discussion with Dentsu, which is a big Japanese media company, and also IMG, the large American management company, about investing in the A-League. I'm not sure who else read about that. Mm-hmm. And taking a 51% stake in the A-League. And I think to my surprise, and I think probably other people's surprise, they were actually knocked back, because I really think that that's possibly what needs to happen, that somebody with deep pockets comes in and effectively takes over the game. I think we were talking about it 2 or 3 weeks ago. When you look at, going back to 2005 and how the MLS has expanded from 11 teams to now 26, and they'll next year 28 and then 30. And the Japanese league, we had Ian Scott on a couple of weeks ago, and I was having some side discussions with him and how they've now got the 3rd professional division. When I came into the A-League in 2005, we really haven't done anything. What are your thoughts on that? Because I don't really right now know who is calling the shots. Is it the FFA in terms of expansion, or is it the clubs now that have the last say on growth?
So it's a really great question, Mel, because it's exactly what Foz and I put forward to James Johnson, because we don't know who's steering the ship. Of course, pre the pandemic, what we understood was this, that since they decided and agreed in principle to hand over the ownership to the owners, it was still under the control, if you will, of Football Federation Australia until the broadcast deal expires, which is in 2023. Then the pandemic struck, and I understand that James Johnson and co have wanted to distance themselves from the A-League because they know that the ownership of it is going to shift over to the owners, and that ultimately they're going to be able to wash their hands of it and focus solely on the national teams and developing grassroots football. That's a key thing that needs to happen. But now, since the pandemic has struck, there's been a lot of confusion around, okay, well, are the owners responsible? Is it FFA? It still is legally FFA's responsibility. So to hear that, like you, that, you know, some investment was knocked back was pretty shocking, because we're at a point now where we're on the precipice of potentially succumbing to the likes of our predecessor, the NSL, and collapsing. And I don't say that to be dramatic, but I'm really concerned. I mean, I put out an article.
Actually, Simon said the same thing a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. I mean, I put out an article 3 months ago, pretty much forecasting that and saying, if we can't get our act together, this is what we're staring down the barrel of. And only today I put out another story which said that ultimately now, and I've had it confirmed from several, you know, quality and credible sources that are close to the negotiations involved with the broadcasting spat, if you will, between Fox Sports and FFA. And it's that now Fox Sports have turned around and said that they're not interested in resuming the competition or seeing out the remainder of it unless FFA accept the new deal that's been tabled by them, which is going to shift from 57 million per year to only 11 million per year. And that in 11, yeah, I did the same thing. I laughed in shock. And that 11 million a year also encompasses production costs. So production costs, you know, for those that don't know, are also really quite expensive. And Fox Sports have outlaid a significant amount of money, well over $1 billion, since they took on the rights when the competition first started. So what we're looking at now is a fundamental issue when it comes to funding. We've lost sponsors. So once the Lowy era departed, with him, he also took a lot of his major corporate partnerships, and now we're in a black hole. But I don't think it's all doom and gloom, for as much as it appears that way when it comes to securing sponsorship dollars, because myself, I've actually had people reaching out to me from overseas saying, can you connect us with James Johnson, or have you got a contact detail for someone that's a governing body, because there are a couple of people in Europe that are potentially interested in investing in the game. So what FFA decide to do with that is entirely up to them. But we're at a significant crossroads here, where we know that financially we're in deep trouble. And it concerns me, because I think, well, if we are to accept a deal like 11 million per season, what message does that send to the remaining broadcasters, that when Fox Sports does walk away, that this is what we're evaluating our league at? No way should we accept 11 million per season, because we have to understand that not only are we worth more than that, irrespective of what our views are, the quality of the competition, which needs a lot of work, etc., we need to send a message that that's just not acceptable for our game. And, you know, we need to start improving, you know, the fundamental ways around how we deal with attracting sponsorship dollars and how we work on retaining them, because we've lost so much money and there's a big gaping hole at the moment.
So how do we attract money? How do we attract sponsors? It can't be through the quality of the game on the field. So how do you think we attract the sponsors to come in?
Oh, that's a question best placed for those that sit atop the ivory tower, I think. You know, it's hard, because when you talk about trying to attract them via the quality of the game, well, that's not necessarily something, as you said there, James, that we can rest on. Is it via marquees? Is it via big names? Well, now, since the rise of the Chinese Super League and the money that they've started to pump into the game, I know that there's been recent reforms and they're going to start to cap those figures. But since all of that's come up, you know, are we going to be able to attract the big name players here in Australia? I don't know. You know, there were rumours circulating that potentially, if you remember, Zlatan Ibrahimovic was going to head over to Perth Glory. Well, we're right down the pecking order now when you think about it in global respects. And, you know, we don't have the best reputation globally when it comes to football. And the fact is, a lot of people don't even know about the league. I mean, when I've spoken to some foreigners over the years, I've asked them what their impressions were. I remember, you know, speaking to several players and saying, well, you know, did you know about the A-League when your agent flagged it with you, when they mentioned it to you? Ross McCormick said the same thing. I said, Ross, before you came here, you know, did you know anything about the A-League? He said, oh, not really. He said, we knew it existed, but we really didn't know anything about it. So it's about trying to get the league to a point where it is starting to be recognised as a well-respected competition. But you can only also do that with time. I mean, Mel mentioned the MLS there. You know, they've got years on us, but they are a similar model in that they are not the primary sport, but they do have the population over in the US. And that's where it differs here in Australia. You know, I think the biggest crime in all of this is that whilst we may not have the population, we do have the participants. And that's where you have to start exploring understand why there are such disconnects between, as you know, I think Laz, you were saying earlier, disconnects between all tiers of the game and why you're not able to bring those together. That seems to be one of the biggest challenges for us, and how we overcome that. Well, it goes back to what I said before. Very cute dog, by the way, Mel. It goes back to what I said before, advocating for that unitary model. You're only going to start to see everybody rowing in the same direction when you've got everybody operating under the one umbrella. Until that happens, everyone is going to continue to do their own things that serves in their best interests. One of the biggest ails of this sport is that self-interest constantly prevails. And I think that's been the nail in our coffin one too many times.
Can I just quickly comment on that?
Of course, Mel, please.
Having been to various board meetings in the past with other owners, one of the problems I think is we've handed over the reins to the lunatics, because there are a lot of owners that I know don't want expansion. Their silly thinking is that by remaining a smaller group, they'll get a bigger slice of the pie, and that's a real problem. And I sort of slightly disagree with Lucy that I think the FFA needs to still be looking after the growth of the game at its highest tier in Australia. Also with the population, I sort of agree, yeah, we don't have the population of, let's say, the States, but that doesn't necessarily make a good football club. You know, I'm going back to my German background. When you look at a little club like Hoffenheim, Hoffenheim's a little village in Germany with a population of about 3,000-4,000 people. And they came up through the dritte Kreisklasse, zweite Kreisklasse, erste Kreisklasse, Kreisliga, Bezirksklasse, Bezirksliga. They went up through 8 or 9 tiers of the German leagues. When they reached about the 4th or 5th highest level, one of the owners of SAP basically became aware of the club. He was living in a village about 10 kilometers away. And once he realized that they'd basically done this, you know, and come through this without any sort of other support, he decided to pump money into the club. If you look at Hoffenheim now, they then went into the 4th division, 3rd division, 2nd division. They've been in the Bundesliga now for about 10 years. They're like a perennial aspirant, you know, to basically go into the UEFA Cup. They've got a stadium which fits 60,000 people. Now they've relocated that club, and basically, they're averaging 30,000 spectators. This is a club with a population of 3,000-4,000. Similar story with RB Leipzig. Leipzig took over a club in Germany with a population of about 20,000. And again, okay, they had the money to put in right from the beginning. And again, steamrolled the competition and are now basically one of the top 2 or 3 clubs in Germany. So I think if you've got a good product, you're automatically, I think, going to attract people that mean well. So yeah, I'll just leave that one at that. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
Interesting points, Mel. You know, when it comes to advocating for entire separation from FFA and the A-League, all of that stems back to the 2004 Crawford report, which I'm sure that, you know, many of you listening to here today have heard ad nauseum, because it was a recommendation that was made all that time ago, because they had identified that, you know, the governing body needed to focus on the development of national teams and to not have to confuse itself, I think, when it ultimately came to the governance of the game. For too long, I feel like the governing body have had a stranglehold on the A-League, and that we haven't been able to see it actually develop and flourish. There are too many rules and regulations in place as well. You know, look at the salary cap, for example. I know that that's been a sore point for many administrators at clubland level, because they're feeling like they're hamstrung and they can't do more. And then you've got clubs like, say, for example, the Central Coast Mariners, who have an owner that really fails to invest and believe in the club and give the staff and the players and the coaches and everybody there the best possible chance of succeeding, because they want to operate at a bare minimum level. That's not fair either. And it's not right. So, you know, when we talk about, I love the comparison that you drew there there with Hoffenheim because I love their story and what they've managed to achieve. And when you look at the ownership models over in the Bundesliga as well, I think that's something that we could potentially explore as well. You know, why don't we give fans a greater investment share within their football clubs, which gives them a reason to actually really get behind them and show support? That's another model that you could explore. And have a look at some of the crazy owners that we have had in the A-League. I mean, Nathan Tinkler being one of them, for example, Clive Palmer closing a stadium off. I mean, this stuff is just almost, you'd have to kind of pinch yourself to ask if this was real life, because we've had some real circus acts over the years, and they've done nothing to grow the brand of the sport and the profile of it. And in fact, what they've done is damage it. So, you know, when it comes to expansion as well, I'm also reticent to say that, you know, well, can we expand our way out of trouble? I'm not sure. We've introduced Western United. Has it had the impact that we were all hoping for? The answer is no. But again, you can add to that the equation of saying, well, should they have been given a license in the first place? There you go. So we're already looking at these things and saying, well, were the right teams given it? No. And I saw you shaking your head earlier when I referenced that. But, you know, this idea that you can't have many teams placed in the one area for fear of saturation, it goes back to what I said about clubs protecting themselves from self-interest. Sydney FC did not want to see Southern expansion come in, as Scott Barlow said, because he felt that it would cut them off at the knees. Guess what, Sydney FC? You had close to 15 years to develop a fan base. You had close to 15 years to go and establish a relationship with the Wollongong Wolves and that community there, but you only decided to do it once you sniffed a threat. That's the problem here. And this whole concept of giving the Wanderers time to basically readjust to their new home, that's ridiculous. You know, again, I've never been there, but go to Anfield. And for those of you that don't know the history, of course, Anfield used to be Everton's home. And then shortly after that, they got kicked out. And you can see, depending on which side of the stadium you stand on, you can actually see Goodison Park. Yeah. And if you're going to talk to me about cutting people and fan bases off at the knees, with time, history, and a lot of love and the right people backing a club, you can have those rivalries. You can have your club succeed. Sydney FC, their membership started to skyrocket once Western Sydney came into the competition because people love rivalries.
Yes.
I was watching the other day the 2004 NSL Grand Final. Don't ask me why. I started going through the archives. It was a dreadful game. My God, terrible to watch. The conditions were awful. But in that coverage, both Johnny Warren and Jean-Paul de Marigny, who we know is the head coach over at the Wanderers, the interim coach at the moment, and a great servant to the game in this country, were both saying we need more teams in Sydney. So this was with the view that the A-League was coming, a better promise was waiting for us on the horizon. And they said, well, it's not good. Why don't we actually have more than one team in Sydney? That needed to happen from the outset. We're having to correct the mistakes of the past on the run to try and revamp this competition. And another thing that's been thrown into the domain and discussed at great length is this idea of promotion relegation and creating a national second team, a national second tier, a national second division, should I say. You know, these are things that needed to be implemented a long time ago, and we needed to start considering these things right from the outset. It wasn't done, and like I said, now we're correcting things on the run. James Johnson said to me in our interview that perhaps a national second division could be on the cards in potentially 2 to 3 years' time. Off the back of that, Graham Arnold said, we can't wait 2 to 3 years, and he's absolutely bloody right. We've got competition that is struggling, that needs a breath of life into it. We didn't get the injection of life from Western United. I don't think we're going to get it from MacArthur, so we can't expand our way out of trouble. What's another way to bring people back into the fold and to bring back some excitement into the game? It's through promotion relegation. But before we get to that, let's set up a functioning and healthy national second division to start to get people back, to start to generate interest again, because that's what we need to do first and foremost. And for those of you that are asking, well, hang on a second, the FFA have set up a national steering committee to start talking about it. Well, I've started speaking to NPL clubs. Guess how many of them have said that they've heard from Football Federation Australia about any kind of consultancy around the national second division? Zero. None of them. And I'm speaking to big national Premier League teams, right, that could potentially be viable in a national second tier. So if you have developed a committee in August of 2018, and we're now, I know the pandemic has taken over, and we're now looking at June, and no one said anything to anyone, then how do we expect to advance in this space? We can't. Don't just set up committees and basically expect everyone to go away because you're actively seen to be doing something, and not have us ask subsequent questions. So over the next few weeks and months, I'm going to speak to all of these NPL clubs and find out which of you are financially viable, which of you would be able to put up your hand and say we could actively participate in a national seconds tier. When I've asked these questions off the record, they've all said we're ready to go. We've got the support. We just need to be given the opportunity. We have failed in the past in Australian football. We've failed in the A-League. It's going to happen. And if clubs are going to fall apart, it's going to be a natural side effect of it. But we cannot keep living in fear that we can't just pull the trigger and go ahead with it. We have to start making changes now because we're in desperate need of it. The people are crying out for it.
Unbelievable. We just when you talk about rivalries there, Lucy, you talk about Liverpool and Everton, you know, you can see Goodison from Anfield. Gavin Ray is on the call, ex-Dundee. I don't know if you know, but Dens Park and Tannadice are directly across the road from each other in Dundee. You know, so you actually go 200 yards, and Karen will tell you that as well. They're directly across the road. So that's true rivalry. That's really true rivalry.
One of the best rivalries in Scottish football that you could list. You know, these are the things that people have to start considering. But we don't look at that because, as I said before, we've just become consumed by self-interest, and that's what's dictating the game now. Why aren't we seeing more clubs pop up in other regions? It's because, as we've said, the existing clubs have too much of a say, too much of a pull with those at the governing body level, and they're hamstrung. They can't do anything about it. So all of this is a game of politics, and quite frankly, we've all had enough of it. We really have.
We're getting some fantastic comments on Facebook, Lucy. We're getting some people saying, you know, Lucy for FFA chairman. You know, we need someone like you that speaks freely, from Glenn Walker, who's making a lot of different comments as well. So, you know, a lot of what you're saying is resonating with the audience here as well. Just for that, we're running, I know we're running short of time. We're in the last sort of 10 minutes before we go into injury time. We do have a couple of questions from one of our guests, and then after that, I'm going to do a quick fire round to you, Lucy. So be prepared for that one. But I'm going to ask Myrid to unmute herself, and come on, she's got 2 questions for you. So fire away, Myrid.
Hi, it's Myrid. Hi, Lucy. Sorry, I don't have my video on. My internet's a bit dodgy.
It's okay, no judgment. Myrid, far away. Hello.
That's right. I'm not gonna lie. I was listening in the car on the way home from work. Sorry. So I kind of had 2 questions. Apologies for the essays. It kind of makes a lot more sense in your head, and then you start writing the question.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was obviously I would love to not bring it back to, but as a female who wants to get further involved in coaching, and is working with some of the men within clubs too, and as a teacher, I know plenty of the kids at school face, I suppose, some similar concerns too. To do with sort of breaking down those walls a little bit, and despite how far society's come, it's still a sort of male-dominated world. And even though there are more females involved, we're still, by a lot of people, considered to be sort of a different species of coach or committee member or whatever your involvement is, journalist, for instance. So I was just curious to see, I suppose, if there have been any key moments, I suppose, that have maybe really reinforced for you perhaps the importance of continuing to pursue being a female in sports journalism, which is still male heavy, and especially football, which again is still, you know, it's a little bit male heavy. That's really made you, I suppose, perhaps if you've been aware of the importance of your success as well, for not just for females, but even for males breaking into a traditionally female world, or, you know, whether it's experience backgrounds that we come from, you know, where you're, I suppose, fighting to get into a world that you're not traditionally perhaps a part of. So yeah, if there's anyone who's perhaps guided you in that, encouraged you, challenged you, and made you determined to prove it.
It's a great question. Thanks, Myrid. You know, for me, I guess one of the greatest difficulties of coming into the role as a woman was that, you know, you're automatically treated different because of your gender, irrespective of your knowledge, irrespective of your passion and what you know, you're already going to be written off in many respects. And I think that the first thing when it came to, you know, sort of me starting out in this television career that I got told a lot of was, oh, you're just a woman. What do you know about the sport? And I find it really insulting because, you know, for us women, and you know, Karen, you could attest to this, and so would you be able to mirror it. You know, we as women never say to male makeup artists who are very prominent globally, we never say to them, you don't belong in our space. We actually admire them for the talent and the knowledge that they bring, because we're not looking at them for their gender, we're looking at them for their knowledge. And I think that, you know, one of the most challenging things when it comes to this is trying to change perception. How do you undo all of these negative associations that some, say, men or even women have when it comes to having these people actively involved in these positions? I'm always going to cop it. You know, Foz could make a mistake and I could make the exact same mistake, but I'm going to be the one that's going to come under fire for it. I think it's just about persevering through all of that and reminding yourself why it is that you do what you do. And if you do have a genuine passion for it, that seems to be the overarching factor. You asked me about inspiration, and this one's a really odd one and a bit left of field. Not odd in the sense of who she is, but you may not be expecting it. But one person that I really admire for the things that they've achieved in football is Corinne Diacre, who happens to be the French national team coach. I mentioned the French national team before because they're a footballing powerhouse in terms of the style of football that they play. And the kind of tactician that she is somebody that I really respect and admire, because I love watching her brand of football, and she's really geared her players to understand it in such a way that it's become almost like, you know, I wouldn't even know who to compare it to. Someone like a Pep Guardiola, that's who she reminds me of. So I really like and respect, because she's often come out in the media when she's been faced with the same sorts of criticism about her gender, and has often said things like, who I am as a woman should not matter here, but who I am as a tactician is what should take precedence. And I think that's how we have to start looking at it. We shouldn't be judging anyone on their gender. We should be judging them on what they bring to the table. So that doesn't discount how difficult it is. And it goes back to what you're saying. The pathways, you know, aren't as great for women who are wanting to get involved in coaching. But what I am saying is that there is a real need for female coaches. I certainly don't think that we have enough of them. And that goes and speaks to what I'm saying there, that we don't create enough opportunities for them. But I would like to see women start to push past those barriers, to start to feel that when there is that element of resistance, that they're able to go, okay, I understand that the opportunities might not be there for me in the first instance, which there weren't when I was kind of coming up as a young studying journalist. You have to make that position for yourself. You have to create that role, and you have to keep pushing past it. I'm standing on the giants of people like Debbie Spillane, for example. She's someone else who I also admire, who retired from the ABC a couple of years ago now. But she was going through sports broadcasting at a time when the discrimination against women in sport was at its most abhorrent, and it was at its most prevalent. Karen, I'm sure you've experienced some of these things in your time as well. You know, I'm lucky because people like Debbie Spillane chose to keep persevering. They chose to stay in the role. They chose to dig their heels in and then provide pathways for people like myself, which made it a hell of a lot easier to break into. So for the existing coaches out there, for the existing female coaches, my advice to them is, don't listen to the criticism. Try to push past it and create that pathway for yourself. If they're not going to open the door for you, you bash that down. You create a window for yourself and you find an avenue and an opportunity, because if you are passionate about the game, you deserve a place at the table. And I'll always stand by that adage.
Yeah, no, that's good, because we're trying, you know, you try to start at a young enough age that they can start before, I suppose, sometimes the cynicism or the doors have kind of worn you out. So, you know, working in a high school, for instance, trying to encourage the girls to do what you're saying, or the boys, whoever it is, with whatever they're doing, while they're young enough to still have that sort of youthful or naivety to a point where they haven't had too many doors yet. And yeah, that, you know, that youthful ability to keep pushing, that hopefully will carry them on in the future. And then they can be the ones that, you know, someone in the future will be saying, oh, they inspired me.
It's hard because, do you know what? I was told no so many times in my journey towards becoming a sports broadcaster. I remember actually going through the rigors of university and being told by one university lecturer that I didn't have the makings of a good journalist. And it was funny actually because after I'd hosted my first World Cup, I deliberately wrote to her and said to her, dear, I won't mention her name, dear blah, blah. I just wanted to write to you to say thank you so much for motivating to me to develop the makings of a great broadcaster. So, you know, I think you need to be told no. I think kids need to be told no, and they need to be rejected to understand what it takes to thrive and survive in an industry that is difficult to succeed in. And that extends to coaching, it extends to broadcasting, it extends to anything at the moment. And post the pandemic, post the pandemic, it's only going to get harder for people to find work. And that's the really worrying thing in all of this. So, you know, to be told no isn't the worst thing in the world. You don't learn anything from being told yes, 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 yes. And I think that, you know, for a large part of why we're struggling in the youth development sense is because we as parents have changed in the way that we parent children as well. We've started to wrap them up in cotton wool a little bit. We've probably over-nurtured them. And, you know, by giving participation awards to everybody, we're not teaching them what it takes to win and lose. So that drive, that motivation, that, you know, that real desperation to succeed and make a name for yourself, we're sucking that out of them. So tell them and encourage them that, you know, being told no isn't the worst thing that's going to happen to you. In fact, it will be the best because it will teach you to overcome the difficulties and it will inspire you to become a stronger and more well-rounded person when you go out into the world. If you haven't been told no, then you're not doing your job yet. And it's only when you're told yes that you'll learn that you've done the right thing.
Yep. Thanks. I think that kind of led on to my second point too. Thank you.
I hope I answered that, Moira. I hope I did.
Oh yeah, totally agree with the cotton wooling. I mean, like I said, a couple of people nodding. Teacher here, I'm totally on board with that.
Yeah, well, you know, Lucy's got a 14-month-old, so I'm sure the wee one won't be up in cotton wool anytime soon. And I know certainly Gavin Rain.
Worst, I'm not the disciplinarian in the house. Corey's the one that says no. I'm advocating for people to say no, and I can't tell my sister. She's too cute. She's just too cute.
So look, we're running. I know that as I say, you know, we normally run these for about 90 minutes. We're running a little bit over, and I know Lucy has got the wee one to put down, but we do have a few questions for you, Lucy. Just a sort of injury time, if you like. So we're in sort of sudden death penalties, if you imagine it. I've got a few questions I want to fire to you, and then I'll pass over to Karen just to make a comment as well on behalf of FCA. So I think you may have answered one or two of these before, but I'm going to ask you just now, favourite team?
Liverpool, by far. They are my club through and through. They were my club since I was about 6 years of age, because I remember asking Ivan, my brother, who was going to football training and had a kit bag by Liverpool, what it was. And he looked down at it and he said, it's the first and only football club you will ever support in your life, and don't you forget it. And guess what? All these years later, I have not forgotten it.
Favourite player?
Oh, that's a hard one. That's a really hard one. Are we going on past, present?
Your favourite player through time? I mean, my personal favourite player is Paolo Maldini, but I've got so much time for Xavi, Iniesta, Beckenbauer, you know, all of these type of players. But you know, just your favourite player?
Stevie G. It's got to be Steven Gerrard. He was an all-rounder, and you know, just I know that a lot of people won't like hearing that, because it would be easy for me to turn around and say the likes of Zinedine Zidane. I could say a Messi. I could say a Ronaldo. I could list off all of these players. You know, Xavi, Iniesta. These are players that were magicians in their time, right? But I just loved everything that Steven Gerrard represented. He was a great representative for the Liverpool Football Club. You know, he was a great servant in many positions across the field. And I just admired him for so much of what he achieved on the football field, for sure. Yeah,
he's a lovely man by all accounts as well. Although he's managing a team that I don't like very much, but that's another story. Most impressive person that you've met in your time?
It's Craig Foster. Yeah, I know that doesn't sound, that's not very sexy answer to a lot of people. You know, you would have expected me to maybe list off a really big footballer's name or something like that. But no, he is an impressive man. My gosh, look at what he did for Hakeem Al Arabi. You know, look at what he's doing for refugees. Look at what he's doing at the moment throughout the pandemic over at Addie Road, servicing the community and those really struggling. This is a guy who was a servant to the game and is a servant to human rights. And I'm so impressed by the man that he is, because he continues to be an inspiration. He's a wonderful father to his children. He's a brilliant husband to his wife, Lara, a beautiful woman. You know, he's someone that I really admire, and, you know, who could measure up to that? He's a very impressive man and someone that I really, really respect.
Yeah, certainly a very, very impressive gentleman. Favourite game?
Favourite game?
You've ever seen. What was that, sorry?
What type of game?
Favourite soccer game? Favourite soccer game you've watched? Favourite game you've seen?
Ooh, Champions League final in Istanbul, Liverpool. Wow.
3-0 to 3-3, yeah?
What a comeback, what a moment. That will go down as my favourite moment in history. Everything that game represented.
What is the best advice you've ever been given?
What is the best advice I've ever been given? It actually comes from my sister. I really like this one. And it kind of relates to if you're going through any tough times. And she'd said to me many years ago when I was going through some just tough times, you know, the usual rigors of life. She said, if you treat every bad situation in life like a Seinfeld episode, you'll always come out on the other side of it laughing. So I try to keep that one close to my heart, because I love Seinfeld. For those of you that don't watch it, it's a great sitcom. So it's served me well over the years.
And the tough question, the toughest question that you're ever going to be asked, and I know, you know, some people might laugh at it, but to me, it's a really, really tough question. Who's the best player? Ivan Zelic, Ned Zelic, or Corey Gamerio?
Oh, gee, whichever answer I give, I'm in trouble. So, yes. I mean, I don't, yeah, can I say unbiasedly, you know, when I consider the footballing career that Ned had, it was just incredible. And you know, I truly believe he was one of the best technically gifted players that we produced in Australia, alongside the likes of Viduka Kuhl, Cahill. You know, these were some amazing footballers, and he was a part of that fantastic era. The only crime is that he didn't do more than what he already had achieved, to be honest, particularly with respect to the national team. But those are reasons he'll have to explain to you, and I can't still after all this time. You know, Ivan, though, the ironic thing is about all of this, when you speak to my dad, I hope Ned doesn't hear this, but when you speak to my dad will tell you that Ivan was actually a far better technically gifted footballer than what Ned was. It's just that Ivan, you know, he chose to retire young because he had passions elsewhere, and very, you know, just passions. So I think that in that respect, it's a really interesting one. For Corey, his is a career that's been ravaged by injury, unfortunately, but, you know, I'm really happy to report that he's on a great path at the moment. He decided to take a year out of football, and it served him so well mentally and physically. He's in really good shape at the moment, and he's really looking forward to getting back into the game at some point once we figure out what's going on with the pandemic. But, you know, at one point in his career, when he was a young kid, he was pursued by the likes of Liverpool. He spent time at Fulham. So this is somebody that has an immense amount of talent. And as his partner and somebody that's observed his career from the outside at one point, I think he's still got a lot to give to the game. So I'd like to see him achieve that. I hope I've answered that question as best as possible.
Very diplomatic.
Wonderful.
Very, very diplomatic. Last question, Lucy. What's your wish? What's your biggest wish for the game in this country?
The biggest wish for the game in this country is for us to fulfill our full potential, and we are nowhere near that. I think that this country has so much to offer to the world in terms of our footballing capabilities. You know, we could still achieve so much more, provided that we start to tap into what we're capable of. And I think that once we get over this hurdle of us being our own worst enemies and stonewalling our own abilities, then we'll be able to really start to see some fantastic progress. So for all of you out there that have the game's best interests at heart, continue to pursue it, because that's what we need to see happen in the short to long-term future if we want to see football succeed.
Karen, can I hand over to you to make comment on behalf of Football Coaches Australia, please?
Yes, my pleasure to do so. On behalf of Football Coaches Australia, I just wanted to thank you so much for your time tonight. I think, you know, I say this on behalf of all the people who are participating and also probably watching it on Facebook as well. Just as the game needs good coaches to produce good players, we need good broadcasters, we need good journalists to report on the game and to promote it. So please keep doing what you're doing with the same passion, with the same knowledge, and with your integrity as well. I think you're a great role model, and you've proven that, you know, not everybody has to be a great player to be able to contribute to the game. We can all contribute. We've all got a passion in some little form of the game, whether it's for coaching, and we definitely need more females coaching. We need more females in broadcasting, but you're not just a good female broadcaster, you're a bloody good broadcaster, full stop. So I just want to say thank you so much for your time tonight. Stay safe, stay well. And as I said, please just keep doing what you're doing, because you're doing it really well.
Oh, Karen, I really appreciate that. Thank you. And I'm just delighted that you all gave me the opportunity to sort of, you know, give my honest opinion about so many things that are going on in the game. And many of those are opinions that you all share. And the knowledge that you guys have is substantially far greater than any knowledge that I've amassed. So it's, you know, we're looking for people like you. I'm learning from people like you to develop these opinions because you are the trusted voices in the game. You've contributed for so long. And we need to start, as I said before, looking inward and not outward in terms of progressing further in this country when it comes to the game. So thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great.
Lucy, it's been an absolute pleasure. On behalf of myself and the guests, thank you so much indeed for taking the time out to join us this evening. I don't think I've spoken to anyone so passionate in a long, long time. So thank you very much indeed for your time. To those on Facebook and on the Zoom webinar, I hope you've enjoyed this evening. As I said before, our next guest in a couple of weeks' time is Peter Hugg, and the focus will be on academies and the pathways in this country, which should make for some interesting conversation. I've already had a few academy directors contact me privately saying that they can't wait for that one. I think it might get a bit frosty, that one. I think that one might get a little bit frosty. But again, on behalf of everyone, thank you very much indeed for joining. If any organisations out there are looking to support Football Coaches Australia and indeed the Football Business Network in situations like this, please let us know. I don't think we're going to get a more passionate guest than Lucy Zelic. So, as I said earlier, if I was 16 years of age and you told me that I'd be talking to a former Miss Universe contestant, I would have been a very, very happy man. So, Lucy, thank you again for your time. I do appreciate it. And to everyone else, good night, stay safe, and we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks so much. Take care, everybody. Keep up the good work.